They called me Sandra's mistake behind closed doors. Her family whispered about the truck driver who'd trapped their precious daughter in a life of mediocrity. For 15 years I nodded along, played the role they'd written for me. But every time her brother called me a working-class hero with that smirk, every time her mother sighed about Sandra's settling, I'd check my phone and see numbers they couldn't imagine. Numbers that would have made their country club memberships look like pocket change. The night Sandra handed me divorce papers demanding half of everything, I almost laughed. She was about to get exactly what she'd always thought I was worth, and discover what 15 years of underestimating someone actually costs. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden wealth and family betrayal, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe that people who judge others by their job title are in for some harsh lessons, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. My name is Bill Watson, and I've been driving trucks for 22 years. Started when I was 26, fresh out of the military with no clear direction and a need to see the country. The open road called to me in a way that desk jobs never could. There's something honest about trucking. You deliver what people need, you get paid for the miles you drive, and nobody pretends the work is glamorous. I met Sandra at a truck stop diner outside Indianapolis in 2008. She was 24, working as a waitress while finishing her nursing degree at night. Dark hair, bright smile, and she was the only server who didn't look at truckers like we were second-class citizens. Most people see the big rig parked outside and assume the driver is uneducated, rough around the edges, maybe even dangerous. Sandra was different. She'd sit and talk during my mandatory rest breaks, asking about the places I'd seen, the sunrises over mountain ranges, the small towns that existed because of highways. She seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on America from behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. "You're not what I expected from a truck driver," she said one evening, sliding me an extra piece of pie I hadn't ordered. "What did you expect?" She blushed. "Someone less articulate, I guess. My family always talked about truckers like they were just a step above criminals." I should have paid attention to that comment. Should have realized that her initial attraction to my profession was the rebellious thrill of dating someone her family wouldn't approve of. But I was smitten with this woman who saw adventure where others saw just another working-class job. We dated for 8 months before I met her family. Sandra had been putting it off, making excuses about schedules and distances. She lived in Carmel, Indiana, an affluent suburb north of Indianapolis where her father, Richard Montgomery, was a partner at a prestigious law firm. Her mother, Patricia, came from old money and spent her time organizing charity galas and sitting on museum boards. The dinner invitation came for Thanksgiving 2009. Sandra's hands shook as she extended it. "They want to meet you," she said, but her tone suggested this wasn't entirely good news. "Fair warning, they can be particular about things. Things like their daughter dating a truck driver." She looked down. "They think I'm going through a phase." The Montgomery family home was a colonial mansion in the historic district, with circular driveways, manicured gardens, and the kind of subtle wealth that doesn't need to announce itself. I drove my personal vehicle, a clean but aging Ford pickup, and immediately felt underdressed despite wearing my best shirt and slacks. Richard Montgomery was exactly what central casting would order for a successful attorney: silver hair, firm handshake, expensive suit, even on a holiday. Patricia was elegant in the way that comes from generations of breeding and money, her jewelry understated but obviously valuable. "So Bill," Richard said as we sat in his mahogany-paneled study before dinner, "Sandra tells us you're in transportation." Transportation, not trucking. I could already see him reshaping my profession into something more palatable for dinner conversation. "Long-haul trucking," I corrected politely. "I drive freight across the country." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Interesting. And what's your long-term plan? Are you working toward management, perhaps starting your own logistics company?" It was a reasonable question, but the subtext was clear. Surely you don't plan to just drive trucks forever. Surely you have ambitions beyond this working-class job. "I enjoy the work," I said simply. "Good money, see the country, meet interesting people." Patricia joined us with cocktails served on a silver tray. Bill was just telling us about his career in trucking. The pause before career was surgical in its precision. Dinner was an education in passive aggression. The questions came wrapped in polite interest, but each one probed for evidence that I was either temporary or ambitious enough to elevate myself beyond my current station. Sandra sat quietly, occasionally shooting me apologetic looks. Her brother Derek arrived late, straight from his job at a financial planning firm. He was younger than Sandra, maybe 22, with the confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself to anyone. "The truck driver," he announced cheerfully as Sandra introduced us. "Mum told me all about you, so you're the one who's shown Sandra the blue-collar life." I extended my hand. "Bill Watson. Derek Montgomery. I handle investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients." He said this like it was supposed to impress me. "Ever think about diversifying your income streams? Trucking can't pay that well." Here we go, I thought. The money conversation. "It pays enough," I said. Derek laughed. "Come on, what do drivers make? 40,000, 50 if you're lucky." "Derek," Sandra warned quietly. "What? I'm just curious about different industries." No judgment here, but his tone said otherwise. Patricia smoothly redirected the conversation, but the damage was done. The evening continued with more subtle digs wrapped in friendly curiosity. How did I handle being away from home so much? Did I worry about the future of trucking with automation coming? Was I saving adequately for retirement on a trucker's income? By the end of the night, I understood perfectly what Sandra had meant about them thinking she was going through a phase. They weren't hostile, exactly. They were patient, waiting for her to outgrow her fascination with rough edges and come back to her proper social circle. The ride home was quiet until Sandra finally spoke. "They'll come around," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "It's okay," I replied and meant it. "They love you, they want what's best for you, and they don't think that's you." I couldn't argue with that assessment. But Sandra was stubborn in the way that privileged children can be when they've decided something is worth fighting for. We kept dating despite her family's obvious disappointment. She'd drive down from Carmel to meet me at various truck stops, and I'd arrange my routes to spend weekends in Indianapolis when possible. A year later I proposed, not with a ring from Tiffany's, but with a simple diamond solitaire I'd saved for months to afford. Sandra said yes immediately, tears in her eyes, and for a moment I thought maybe love would be enough to bridge the class divide. The wedding planning revealed how naive that hope had been. "We need to discuss the guest list," Patricia said during one of our meetings at the country club. She spoke directly to Sandra as if I wasn't sitting right there. "The Richardsons will expect an invitation, and the Thorntons, of course. Will Bill's people be comfortable at the club?" "My people? Like we were different species. Bill's family is perfectly capable of handling themselves at a country club," Sandra said defensively. I appreciated her loyalty, but the truth was my family would be uncomfortable. My parents were good people. Dad worked construction, Mum was a secretary at an insurance office, but they'd never been in spaces designed to intimidate anyone without the right credentials. "Of course," Patricia said smoothly. "I just want everyone to feel welcome." The wedding cost $47,000. Richard wrote the check without blinking, but made sure I knew it. Not in a cruel way, just in a matter-of-fact manner that established exactly who was paying for his daughter's fairy tale day.
"Sandra deserves the best," he told me privately. "I trust you understand that."
I did understand. I also understood that I was now in debt to a man who saw me as a temporary fixture in his daughter's life. We honeymooned in Cabo, another gift from Richard and Patricia. Sandra glowed with happiness, posting photos on social media of sunset dinners and couples massages. Her friends commented with heart emojis and congratulations. A few mentioned how adventurous she was for marrying someone so different. That should have been my second warning. But for the first few years, we were genuinely happy. Sandra finished her nursing degree and got a job at a prestigious hospital in Indianapolis. We rented a small house in a modest neighborhood, splitting the costs down the middle, even though my income was actually higher than hers, something her family never bothered to verify. I'd learned early in trucking that there were two kinds of drivers, those who spent every penny they made on the road, and those who understood that trucking could be incredibly lucrative if you played it smart. I fell into the second category. While other drivers bought expensive trucks with chrome and custom paint jobs, I drove company vehicles and avoided the debt. While they ate at truck stop restaurants every meal, I packed sandwiches and cooked on a small portable stove. While they stayed in motels every night, I slept in my cab whenever possible. The money added up quickly when you weren't trying to live large on the road. But more importantly, I'd stumbled onto something the Montgomery family would never have expected from a simple truck driver. I was good at reading markets. It started innocently enough. Driving cross-country, you see economic patterns that people in offices miss. You deliver construction supplies to boom towns before the news reports mention growth. You haul raw materials to factories ramping up production. You carry goods to retailers preparing for trends that haven't hit the mainstream yet. In 2010, I started buying stock in a small logistics company that was picking up contracts I'd been watching. Nothing fancy, just $1,000 investment from my savings account. 6 months later, they got bought out by a larger corporation. My 1,000 became 3,500. That got my attention. I began researching companies connected to the freight I was hauling. If I was delivering equipment to fracking sites, I'd look into oil service companies. If I was carrying building supplies to plant communities, I'd investigate local real estate trends. If I was hauling components for wind turbines, I'd study renewable energy stocks. The beauty of trucking was that I saw the economy from ground level, months before it showed up in quarterly reports or financial news. I was like a scout for my own investment strategy. Sandra knew I'd started investing, but she didn't pay much attention to the details. Her family certainly didn't. They were too busy patronizing me about my simple profession to consider that I might have additional income streams. "Bill's always been good with money," Sandra would tell her mother when asked about our finances. "Truckers have to budget carefully." This statement was technically true, but missed the larger picture entirely. By 2012, my investment account had grown to $87,000. I'd diversified beyond individual stocks into mutual funds, bonds, and index funds. I even bought shares in trucking companies, betting on the industry I knew best. Sandra thought my financial discipline was cute in a working-class way. Her family saw it as evidence of how carefully someone with limited income had to manage every dollar. Neither perspective bothered me. In fact, I began to enjoy the misconception. There was something liberating about being underestimated. It freed me from expectations and gave me cover to pursue opportunities they'd never see coming. The real game changer came in 2013 when I noticed patterns in natural gas shipments to areas that weren't typically industrial. I started researching property records and discovered that energy companies were quietly leasing land for potential drilling operations. The local real estate was still priced as if these were just rural farming communities. I took a calculated risk and bought 6 acres in North Dakota for $12,000. The land was flat, unremarkable, and exactly what the energy companies would need for staging areas if drilling expanded to that region. 18 months later, Halliburton offered me $140,000 for a 3-year lease on those 6 acres. I took the deal. Sandra was stunned when I told her about the windfall. "You made that much money from land. How did you know to buy it?" "Lucky guess," I said, which was mostly true. I'd gotten lucky that my research had paid off so dramatically. "We could buy a house," she said excitedly. "A real house, not this rental. Maybe something in a better neighborhood." Her definition of better neighborhood meant closer to where her family lived. I wasn't opposed to buying a house, but I had different ideas about how to use the money. "Let's invest most of it," I suggested. "Buy a house we can afford with normal income and let the rest grow." Sandra looked disappointed but agreed. We bought a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class suburb for $180,000, putting down 20% and financing the rest. It was a nice house. Clean, safe, good schools nearby for when we had kids, but nothing that would impress the Montgomery family. "It's cozy," Patricia said when she first visited, her tone suggesting that cozy was not a compliment. "The neighborhood is developing," Sandra said defensively. "Property values are going up." Richard nodded politely, but I could see him calculating that his daughter was living in a house worth less than his car. Meanwhile, I was quietly investing the remaining money from the land deal, plus continuing to add to my portfolio with every paycheck. By 2014, my total investments had crossed $200,000. I started looking into real estate more seriously, not as a place to live, but as an asset class. The beauty of trucking was that I saw properties all across the country. Small apartment buildings in growing cities, commercial real estate near expanding industrial areas, land that was still agricultural but positioned for development. I bought my first rental property in 2015, a duplex in Columbus, Ohio, near a university that was expanding its engineering program. I put $25,000 down and financed the rest. The rental income covered the mortgage, taxes, and maintenance, and I was building equity in an area I predicted would appreciate. Sandra knew about the duplex but didn't understand the larger strategy. Her family definitely didn't. They occasionally asked how the little rental property was doing, their tone implying it was a cute hobby for someone without real investment options. "Bill's always looking for ways to make extra money," Sandra would explain. "You know how truck drivers have to hustle." Again, technically true, but completely missing the point. By 2016, I owned 3 rental properties and had over $400,000 in various investment accounts. I was generating passive income from rents, dividends, and capital gains while still drawing my trucking salary. But to Sandra's family, I was still just the truck driver who'd gotten lucky with one land deal. The dynamic became even more pronounced after Sandra and I had been married 5 years. Her friends were buying larger houses, joining country clubs, sending their kids to private schools. Sandra began making comments about keeping up with their lifestyle. The Richardsons bought that gorgeous house in Geist, she'd say, referring to one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Indianapolis. 4 bedrooms, 3-car garage, pool. How much did it cost? I'd ask. I don't know, maybe $400,000. I knew exactly how much it cost, $475,000, because I'd looked at similar properties as potential investments and decided the numbers didn't make sense for rentals in that area. We could afford something like that, Sandra continued, if we used your investment money for a down payment. This conversation happened repeatedly, in various forms. Sandra saw my growing net worth as money we should be spending on lifestyle upgrades. I saw it as capital that needed to keep working. We're doing fine, I'd say. The house is paid off now. We have everything we need. But we could have everything we want. The difference between need and want became a recurring theme in our marriage. Sandra had grown up with want being automatically satisfied. If her parents desired something, they acquired it. The concept of deliberately limiting purchases to maximize long-term wealth was foreign to her. Her family's attitude toward money was even more telling. They spent freely because they'd always had money. The idea that someone might accumulate wealth through careful planning, rather than inheritance or high professional salaries, was outside their experience. Bill's very frugal, Patricia would say, making frugality sound like a character flaw. I suppose that's necessary on a truck driver's salary. Derek, who was now married and working at a larger financial planning firm, was particularly condescending about money. He'd started calling me his blue-collar brother-in-law and offering unsolicited advice about retirement planning. You need to be putting away at least 10%, he'd lecture during family dinners. Social security won't be enough, and trucking doesn't have great pension plans. I'd nod politely while mentally calculating that I was saving closer to 60% of my total income and that my portfolio was likely generating more annual returns than he was making in salary. The disconnect became almost amusing. Here was Derek, who managed other people's money for a living, completely oblivious to the fact that the truck driver at the table had built more wealth than most of his clients. But the amusement began turning to irritation as the years passed and the condescension intensified. The breaking point came during Christmas dinner in 2018. We were at the Montgomery house as always, surrounded by expensive decorations and imported wine. Derek had brought his wife Kelly, a social media manager who spent most of the evening taking photos of the food and posting them online. Ever think about career advancement? Maybe getting into logistics management? I like driving, I said for probably the 100th time. But don't you want more? Kelly chimed in. Like Sandra could be living so much better if you had a real career path. Sandra shot her a sharp look. Bill provides just fine. I'm sure he does, Kelly said quickly. I just meant, upward mobility, growth potential. Richard cleared his throat. Everyone has their own path. Some people are content with simple work. Simple work. As if moving millions of dollars worth of freight safely across the country required no skill, knowledge or responsibility. Exactly, Patricia agreed. Not everyone needs to climb the corporate ladder. Society needs people willing to do essential jobs. Essential jobs, said with the kind of tone usually reserved for discussing garbage collection or sewer maintenance. Derek raised his wine glass. To essential workers, he said with a grin. We literally couldn't survive without them. The toast was meant to be inclusive, but it felt like being patted on the head. I raised my glass and drank the wine while internally calculating that my net worth had probably surpassed Derek's sometime in the past 6 months. After dinner, Richard asked to speak with me privately in his study. These conversations had become an annual tradition, his way of checking in on how I was taking care of his daughter. Sandra seems happy, he said, settling into his leather chair. I hope so. She mentioned you've been resistant to moving to a nicer neighborhood. Something about not wanting to increase your mortgage payments. I waited to see where this was going. Patricia and I would be happy to help with a down payment, he continued, if it would allow Sandra to live more appropriately. There it was. The offer came every few years in various forms. Financial assistance to upgrade our lifestyle to match Sandra's background, always presented as generosity, always carrying the implication that I couldn't provide adequately on my own. That's generous, I said, but we're comfortable where we are. Richard studied me over his glasses. Sometimes comfort isn't enough, Bill. Sandra grew up with certain expectations. She's been very patient, but he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Sandra was making sacrifices to be with me, and those sacrifices had limits. I'll keep that in mind, I said. The ride home was tense. Sandra had clearly been having similar conversations with her mother. Would it kill you to consider their offer? She asked as I pulled into our driveway. They're trying to help. Help with what? We don't need help. We need a better house, Bill. I'm tired of making excuses for where we live. Excuses to who? To everyone. My friends, my family, my co-workers. They all live in nicer places. They're all moving forward with their lives. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark garage for a moment. What would moving forward look like to you? A real house, in a real neighborhood, with real potential for appreciation. I almost laughed at the irony. Our current house had appreciated 37% since we'd bought it. My real estate investments were generating more monthly income than Sandra made in her nursing job, but she saw none of that as real, because it didn't fit the image she wanted to project. Let's talk about this tomorrow, I said finally, but we didn't talk about it tomorrow, or the next day, or the next. The conversation just hung between us like smoke, coloring everything else. By 2019, my investment portfolio had crossed $800,000. I owned 5 rental properties across 3 states, all generating positive cash flow. My trucking income was now almost secondary to my investment returns, but I kept driving because I genuinely enjoyed the work and because it gave me cover for the lifestyle I was really living. Sandra knew the numbers. I'd never hidden my financial statements from her, but she didn't understand what they meant in practical terms. To her, 800,000 was a large number that should translate into a larger house, newer cars and more expensive vacations. To me, 800,000 was capital that needed to be carefully managed to become 1.2 million, then 2 million, then enough to provide true financial independence. The gap in our thinking was becoming unbridgeable. The final straw came in early 2020, just before the pandemic changed everything. Sandra's friend Jennifer was getting divorced and had started confiding in Sandra about her settlement. Jennifer's husband was a pharmaceutical sales rep who made good money, and their divorce was splitting assets worth about $300,000. She's getting half of everything, Sandra told me after one of their coffee dates. The house, his 401k, even his company stock options. She'll be fine financially. I waited to see where this was going. It made me think about our situation, Sandra continued carefully. Like if something happened between us, what would I get? The question hit me like a cold wind. Are you thinking about divorce? No, I'm just thinking about security. Financial security. You'd get half of everything, same as anyone else. Sandra looked at me strangely. Half of what exactly? The house is worth maybe $250 now. Your truck is company owned. What else is there? I stared at her, slowly realizing that despite having access to all our financial records, Sandra had never actually calculated our total net worth. She saw the individual accounts and properties as separate entities, not as components of a larger portfolio. There's more than the house, I said carefully. How much more? I pulled out my phone and opened my financial tracking app. The numbers were all there. Investment accounts, rental property equity, business holdings. Total net worth, $1.2 million. Sandra looked at the screen for a long moment, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something approaching anger. You've had over $1 million this whole time. We've had it. It's our money. Then why are we living like this? She gestured around our comfortable but modest living room. Why are we driving 10-year-old cars and shopping at Walmart if we're millionaires? Because that's how you stay millionaires, I said. The money only works if you don't spend it. Sandra stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. What's the point of having money if you never use it? This conversation revealed the fundamental difference in how we thought about wealth. To Sandra, money was for spending on lifestyle improvements. To me, money was for generating more money. We use the income it generates, I tried to explain. The rental properties pay for themselves and give us extra cash flow. The investment returns cover our living expenses. The principal keeps growing. But we could buy a beautiful house. We could travel. We could actually enjoy our money. We could also lose it all if we make bad decisions. Sandra went quiet for several days after that conversation. I could see her processing the information, trying to reconcile her image of our life with the financial reality I'd been quietly building. When she finally spoke again, her words chilled me. I've been thinking about what my friends would say if they knew we had this much money. They'd wonder why I was married to a truck driver who makes me live like we're poor. There it was. The real issue wasn't about financial security or smart money management. It was about image, about what story our lifestyle told about Sandra's choices. I'm not making you do anything, I said quietly. You can spend money on whatever you want. That's not the point, Bill. The point is that I shouldn't have to ask permission to live appropriately for our income level. You've never asked permission. You've always had access to our accounts. But I felt guilty about spending because you made it seem like we couldn't afford things. I had never said we couldn't afford things. I'd said we shouldn't buy things that didn't make financial sense. But Sandra had interpreted my caution as limitation rather than strategy. The pandemic lockdowns of 2020 should have brought us closer together, but instead they highlighted how far apart we'd grown. Stuck at home, Sandra spent hours on social media looking at her friends' houses, vacations, and lifestyle purchases. She'd show me posts from college friends who were renovating their kitchens or buying boats, and I could see the resentment building. Look at this, she'd say, showing me photos from Jennifer's new condo. This is what normal people our age are doing with their money. Jennifer's divorced, I'd point out. She had to liquidate assets to buy that place. At least she's living appropriately for her income level. Appropriately. That word came up more and more in our conversations. Sandra had developed a theory that there was an appropriate lifestyle for each income bracket, and that deliberately living below your means was somehow dishonest or shameful. Her family reinforced this thinking during our socially distanced outdoor visits. They'd make comments about how humble our lifestyle was, how admirable it was that I was so careful with money. The subtext was always the same. They thought I was being cheap, and they pitied Sandra for having to live beneath her station. Derek, who had started his own financial planning practice, was particularly vocal about our choices. "You know, Bill," he said during one family barbecue, "there's something to be said for enjoying your wealth while you're young enough to appreciate it. What good is money in the bank if you never actually improve your quality of life?" "Our quality of life is fine," I replied, "but it could be so much better. Sandra deserves to live in a house that reflects her accomplishments. She's a successful nurse, married to a constellation toftic papramoral muka." Why hide that success? Why hide it? Because the moment I stopped hiding it, everything would change. The dynamic with Sandra's family, the assumptions people made about my intelligence and capabilities, the freedom I had to make financial decisions without interference from people who thought they knew better. But Sandra was no longer content with hiding it. "I want us to buy a new house," she announced one evening in late 2020. "Something that shows who we really are." Who are we, really? Successful, financially secure, not ashamed of what we've accomplished. I hadn't realized we were ashamed, but I could see that Sandra felt that way. She experienced our modest lifestyle as a form of deception, as if we were lying about our true status in life. "Let's look at some properties," I said finally, hoping that seeing the numbers would change her mind. The houses Sandra wanted to see were all in the $400,000 to $600,000 range. Beautiful homes in excellent neighborhoods with great schools and convenient commutes to downtown Indianapolis. Exactly the kind of properties her friends owned. They were also terrible investments, overpriced for the current market, carrying high property taxes, and located in areas where appreciation had already peaked. Buying one would mean tying up hundreds of thousands of dollars in a depreciating asset, while taking on a mortgage payment 3 times our current housing costs. "This one is perfect," Sandra said, as we toured a 5-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage and swimming pool. "Can you imagine hosting Christmas here? My parents would be so proud." That phrase stuck with me. My parents would be so proud. After 12 years of marriage, Sandra was still trying to prove to her family that she'd made the right choice. "It's a lot of house," I said diplomatically. "We can afford it. Affording something and buying it are different things." Sandra's enthusiasm faded. "There you go again, making it about money. It is about money. This house costs $540,000. Our current house is worth $300,000, so we'd need to finance $240,000 plus closing costs. The mortgage payment would be around $1,800 a month. So that's $1,800 a month. That's not going into investments, plus higher insurance, higher utilities, higher maintenance costs. We'd be reducing our net worth to increase our housing costs." Sandra stared at me in the empty living room of the house she'd fallen in love with. "I don't want to reduce our net worth," she said quietly. "I want to enjoy it." That night, Sandra called her mother. I could hear half the conversation from the next room, and it was clear that Patricia was encouraging Sandra to push harder for the lifestyle upgrade. "He's being unreasonable," Sandra was saying. "We have the money, we're just not allowed to use it." I knocked on the bedroom door and stepped inside. Sandra was sitting on our bed with her phone, tears in her eyes. "Let me talk to your mum," I said. Sandra hesitated, then handed me the phone. "Patricia, it's Bill." "Oh, hello, dear." "Sandra's a bit upset about the house situation." "I understand that. Can I explain our perspective on this?" There was a pause. "Of course. We have a good life. Our house is paid off. We have no debt. And our investments are growing steadily. Buying a more expensive house would actually make us poorer in the long run." "But you can afford it, can't you?" "Sandra says you have quite a bit saved." "We can afford the payments, yes. But affording something and it being a good decision are different things." "Bill," Patricia's voice took on the patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children. "Money is meant to be used. There's no point in accumulating wealth if you never enjoy the benefits. We do enjoy the benefits. We have financial security. We don't worry about money. But Sandra worries about appearances. She's embarrassed by your conservative approach." conservative approach. Another euphemism for what her family really thought, that I was too cheap, too working class, too unsophisticated to understand how successful people should live. "I'll think about it," I said and handed the phone back to Sandra. But I wasn't thinking about buying a bigger house. I was thinking about the growing gap between what Sandra wanted from our marriage and what I was willing to provide. The house hunting continued for several more weeks. Sandra found 3 more properties she loved, each one more expensive than the last. I ran the numbers on all of them and reached the same conclusion. Buying any of these houses would be a financial step backward disguised as a lifestyle upgrade. Finally, I made a counter-proposal. "What if we renovated our current house?" I suggested. "Updated the kitchen, finished the basement, maybe added a deck. We could make it exactly what we want without taking on a mortgage." Sandra's face fell. "That's not the same thing." "Why not?" "Because the address would still be the same, the neighborhood would still be the same." And there it was, the truth she'd been dancing around for months. This wasn't about the house at all. It was about the address, about being able to say she lived in Carmel instead of a middle-class suburb, about fitting in with her family's social circle. "Sandra," I said carefully, "are you happy with me, or are you happy with the idea of being married to someone who lives in Carmel?" She didn't answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. "I love you," she said finally, "but I hate feeling like I have to apologize for our life." "Who are you apologizing to?" "Everyone. My friends, my family, my co-workers. They all live better than we do, and I have to pretend it's by choice." "It is by choice. It's by your choice. I never chose to live like we're struggling when we're not." The argument that followed was our biggest in 12 years of marriage. Sandra accused me of being controlling, secretive, and ashamed of success. I accused her of being materialistic, insecure, and more concerned with appearances than financial security. We both said things we couldn't take back. The aftermath was a cold detente that lasted through the winter of 2021. We were polite to each other, civil in public, but the intimacy was gone. Sandra threw herself into work and spent more time with her friends. I focused on my investments and took longer routes that kept me away from home for extended periods. By spring, Sandra had made a decision. "I want us to go to counseling," she announced one evening. "We need help figuring this out." I agreed, though I suspected that Sandra saw counseling as a way to get professional validation that I was being unreasonable about money. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a marriage counselor in her mid-50s with a calm demeanor and an office designed to put couples at ease. During our first session, she asked us to explain our perspectives on the central conflict in our marriage. Sandra spoke first, describing her frustration with my unwillingness to enjoy our success and my controlling behavior around money. She painted a picture of a woman trapped in an artificially modest lifestyle by a husband who hoarded wealth out of some misguided fear of spending. When it was my turn, I tried to explain my philosophy about money as a tool for building security rather than status. I described the pressure I felt from Sandra's family to live up to standards that made no financial sense. Dr. Martinez listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Sandra, when you say Bill is controlling about money, can you give me specific examples? He vetoes every major purchase. When I want to upgrade something or move to a better house, he shows me spreadsheets about why it's a bad investment. I don't veto anything. I present information and express my opinion. Sandra has access to all our accounts. She could make these purchases without my involvement if she chose to." "But you'd be angry if I did," Sandra interjected. "I'd be disappointed if you made decisions that hurt our long-term financial security." "Yes." Dr. Martinez made notes. "It sounds like you have fundamentally different relationships with money. Sandra, yours is more emotional and immediate. Bill, yours is more strategic and long-term. Neither approach is wrong, but they're creating conflict." Over the following sessions, we worked through various scenarios and compromises. Dr. Martinez suggested that we allocate a specific percentage of our investment income for lifestyle upgrades, allowing Sandra to make some changes while preserving the core of our financial strategy. It was a reasonable compromise, and for a few months it seemed to work. Sandra redecorated our living room and bought a newer car. I transferred $50,000 to a separate account she could use for these kinds of purchases without affecting our investment plans. But the deeper issue remained unresolved. Sandra still felt embarrassed by our address and frustrated by what she saw as my excessive caution. I still felt pressure to justify every financial decision to someone who didn't share my priorities. The breaking point came at Derek's housewarming party in fall 2021. Derek and Kelly had bought a house in one of Indianapolis's most exclusive neighborhoods. It was a stunning property, 6 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, chef's kitchen, home theater, the works. The mortgage payment had to be enormous, but Derek was doing well in his financial planning practice, and Kelly's social media consulting business was growing. The party was typical for Sandra's social circle: expensive wine, catered food, conversations about home renovations and vacation destinations. I found myself standing in Derek's 3-car garage, admiring his collection of vehicles while trying to calculate how much debt he was carrying to maintain this lifestyle. "Impressive setup," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Marcus Webb, one of Derek's business partners and a longtime friend of the Montgomery family. Marcus was one of those guys who wore his wealth casually, but obviously, expensive watch, designer clothes, the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. Derek's done well for himself, I replied. Marcus laughed. Derek's leveraged to the hilt. This house, the cars, the boat he's buying next spring, it's all financed. But that's how you play the game when you're young and your income is trending up. Seems risky. Everything's risky. The question is whether you're taking smart risks or stupid ones. Marcus studied me. Sandra tells me you're more conservative. Nothing wrong with that, but don't you ever want to live a little? Here we go again, I thought. Another lecture about enjoying life while you can. We live fine, I said. I'm sure you do, but there's a difference between living fine and living well. Sandra's a beautiful woman from a good family. She could have married anyone. Don't you think she deserves better than fine? The comment hit exactly the nerve it was designed to hit. Marcus wasn't being cruel, just honest in the way that wealthy people often are about what they see as obvious truths. Later that evening, as Sandra and I drove home through Derek's gated neighborhood, she was unusually quiet. What did you think? I asked. It's beautiful. Exactly the kind of place we could afford if we wanted to. We could afford the payments. That's different from affording the house. Sandra turned to look at me in the darkened car. Marcus said something interesting tonight. I waited. He said that successful people invest in their image because image creates opportunities, that living beneath your means sends the wrong message about your capabilities. What message is that? That you're not confident enough in your future earning power to take on appropriate debt, that you're playing not to lose instead of playing to win. It was an interesting theory, and completely wrong for our situation. Marcus and Derek were in professions where image mattered for business development. Derek needed to look successful to attract high net worth clients. Marcus needed to project wealth to build trust with investors. I was a truck driver whose income didn't depend on anyone's opinion of my lifestyle. My investment success came from seeing opportunities that other people missed, not from appearing successful enough to deserve them. That might be true for Derek's business, I said. It's not true for ours. But it's true for my life, Sandra said quietly. For my career, my friendships, my family relationships. When people see how we live, they make assumptions about who we are and what we're capable of. This was probably true. Sandra worked in a professional environment where her colleagues judged each other based on cars, clothes, and home addresses. Her friendships were with people who measured success by lifestyle markers. Her family had specific expectations about how successful people should live. I just didn't think those opinions were worth paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to influence. What if we compromised differently? I suggested. What if we bought a nicer house but kept it smaller? Something in a good neighborhood but within our actual budget? Sandra shook her head. It's not about the budget, Bill. It's about the statement. A small house in a good neighborhood sends a different message than a large house in the same neighborhood. What message do you want to send? That I'm successful, that I made good choices, that my husband provides well for me. That last phrase stung. After 13 years of building wealth that would provide for both of us indefinitely, Sandra was worried that people thought I didn't provide well for her. The conversation ended in familiar territory. Sandra frustrated by my inability to see her perspective, me frustrated by her concern for other people's opinions about our financial choices. But something had shifted. Sandra was no longer asking me to compromise on spending. She was asking me to change my fundamental approach to money and status. She wanted me to become the kind of person who bought houses to impress neighbors and cars to project success. That wasn't who I was, and it wasn't who I wanted to become. The marriage limped through the winter of 2022. We attended family gatherings and social events, maintaining the appearance of unity while growing further apart in private. Sandra spent more time at work and with friends. I took longer routes and extended trips, using the road as an escape from the tension at home. By spring we were more like roommates than spouses, polite, considerate, but no longer connected by shared goals or mutual understanding. The end came during Easter dinner at the Montgomery house. It was the usual gathering: expensive ham, imported wine, conversations about real estate and stock portfolios. Derek had brought his new boat down from the lake for everyone to admire. Kelly was planning a kitchen renovation that would cost more than some people's annual salaries. I sat quietly through most of the dinner, contributing occasionally to conversations about interest rates and inflation, topics where my investment experience was actually relevant. After dessert, Derek pulled out his laptop to show everyone photos from their recent vacation to Turks and Caicos. The resort looked magnificent, the kind of place where a week costs more than most people spend on vacations in a year. You and Sandra should come with us next time, Kelly suggested. The resort has a great couples package. Sounds expensive, I said diplomatically. Everything's expensive, Derek laughed. That's what credit cards are for. Richard cleared his throat. Speaking of expenses, I've been meaning to ask about your housing situation. Any progress on finding something more suitable? The question was directed at Sandra, but everyone looked at me. I could feel the familiar weight of their collective judgment. We're still looking, Sandra said quickly. Looking at what? Patricia asked. I could make some calls if you need a good realtor. We've seen some beautiful properties, Sandra continued. Bill's just very careful about making decisions. Careful, another euphemism. Derek jumped in. What's the hesitation? You guys are sitting on serious money. Why not live a little? Marcus, who had been invited as Derek's business partner, nodded in agreement. Life's short, you can't take it with you. You also can't spend it if you don't have it, I replied. But you do have it, Kelly said. Sandra told us about your investments. You're like secretly rich. The words hung in the air like smoke. Sandra looked mortified that Kelly had been so direct, but she didn't deny it. Rich is relative, I said carefully. Come on, Derek said. Sandra showed Kelly your portfolio screenshots. You've got over $1 million. That's rich by any reasonable standard. I looked at Sandra, who was staring at her dessert plate. She'd been sharing our private financial information with her friends. Information I'd never said she couldn't share, but had assumed she wouldn't. The point isn't how much we have, I said. The point is preserving it. Preserving it for what? Richard asked. You're not that young anymore. When do you plan to actually use this wealth you've accumulated? There it was, the question that had been building for months. When would I stop being careful and start being careless? When would I abandon the strategies that had built our wealth in favor of spending it on lifestyle upgrades? We use it every day, I said. It provides security. It gives us options. It means we don't have to worry about money. But you do worry about money, Patricia observed. You worry about it constantly. You think about it more than people who actually don't have any. She wasn't wrong. I did think about money constantly, about investment opportunities, about market trends, about protecting what we'd built. But I thought about it the way a pilot thinks about weather conditions, or a doctor thinks about symptoms. It was professional awareness, not anxiety. I think about money strategically, I said. That's different from worrying about it. Derek leaned forward. But don't you want to enjoy the fruits of your labor? What good is financial security if you never feel secure enough to spend any money? The conversation was taking on the familiar tone of an intervention. Everyone at the table was united in their belief that I was doing something wrong, something that was hurting Sandra and preventing us from living properly. I think, Richard said in his lawyer voice, that the real question is about balance. No one's suggesting you spend all your money on frivolous things, but surely there's a middle ground between financial recklessness and the kind of extreme frugality that prevents you from enjoying success. What would that middle ground look like? I asked. A nicer house, Patricia said immediately. In a better neighborhood. Something that reflects your actual financial position. A lifestyle that matches your income level, Derek added. Showing Sandra that you're proud of what you've accomplished together, Marcus concluded. I looked around the table at these people who had spent 15 years underestimating me, who were now lecturing me about how to handle wealth they'd never imagined I possessed. And if I don't want those things? I asked. The question seemed to confuse them. The possibility that someone might voluntarily choose modest living when they could afford luxury was outside their experience. But why wouldn't you want them? Kelly asked. Why would anyone choose to live below their means if they don't have to? I could have explained about the difference between assets and liabilities, about the power of compound interest, about the freedom that comes from not being dependent on maintaining an expensive lifestyle. I could have talked about the satisfaction of building something substantial rather than just consuming it. Instead, I said, because I like our life the way it is. The silence that followed was heavy with disapproval. Finally, Sandra spoke. But I don't, she said quietly. I don't like our life the way it is. Everyone looked at her. She'd never been so direct about her dissatisfaction in front of her family. I'm tired of making excuses for where we live and how we live, she continued. I'm tired of feeling like I have to apologize for my choices. I want to live appropriately for our income level. What does that mean exactly? I asked. Sandra met my eyes across the table. It means I want a divorce. The words hit the table like a bomb. No one moved or spoke for several long seconds. Sandra, Patricia said carefully, that seems drastic. We've been having this argument for years, Sandra said, her voice gaining strength. Bill will never change. He'll never spend money on anything that might improve our quality of life. He's perfectly happy living like we're struggling financially when we're not. Have you considered counseling? Richard asked. We tried counseling. It didn't work because we want different things out of life. I sat quietly, processing the fact that my marriage was ending in front of an audience of people who had never respected me anyway. What do you want out of life? I asked Sandra. I want to live like a successful person. I want a house I'm proud of, in a neighborhood where I fit in. I want to travel and buy nice things and not have to justify every purchase to someone who thinks spending money is a character flaw. And you can't have those things with me. Not unless you change who you are, and you've made it clear that you won't. She was right about that. I wouldn't change my approach to money to satisfy her family's expectations or her friends' opinions. I'd built wealth by making careful decisions, and I wasn't going to abandon that strategy to buy social acceptance. I think Derek said carefully that maybe you two should discuss this privately. There's nothing left to discuss, Sandra said. I've already talked to a lawyer. That revelation generated surprised murmurs around the table. Sandra had been planning this divorce while we were still attending counseling sessions. When? I asked. Last week. Jennifer referred me to her attorney, Jennifer, the friend whose divorce settlement Sandra had admired so much, the friend who was now living appropriately for her income level in a condo she'd bought with her ex-husband's money. What did the lawyer say? Sandra hesitated. That I'm entitled to half of everything. I nodded slowly. You are entitled to half of everything, which is about $600,000. The number sent another ripple of surprise around the table. Even knowing I was a millionaire, hearing the actual settlement amount made it real in a way that portfolio screenshots hadn't. That's enough to buy a nice house, Kelly said encouragingly, and live comfortably, Patricia added. For a while, I said quietly. Everyone looked at me. $600,000 is enough to buy a house and live comfortably for a while, I clarified. But without ongoing income from investments, it won't last forever, especially if you're planning to maintain an expensive lifestyle. Sandra's face flushed. Are you threatening me? I'm stating facts. The money we have generates income because it's invested. If you take your half out and spend it on consumption instead of assets, it won't regenerate itself. I'll invest some of it, Sandra said defensively. In what? Do you have an investment strategy? The question hung in the air. Sandra had never shown interest in how our wealth was built or maintained. She'd left all of that to me while focusing on her nursing career and social life. I'll figure it out, she said finally. Or, Derek said, you could hire a financial advisor, someone who understands wealth management. Marcus nodded. I know some excellent advisors who specialize in divorce settlements. They can help you structure your assets appropriately. I almost laughed at the irony. Here were people who had spent 15 years treating me like an unsophisticated truck driver, now discussing how to manage wealth I'd built through strategies they'd never understood or appreciated. That sounds like a good plan, I said. You should definitely get professional advice. Sandra looked at me suspiciously, like she was waiting for me to argue or try to talk her out of the divorce. You're not going to fight this? She asked. Fight what? You've made your choice. You want a different life than the one we built together. I understand that. Just like that? Just like that. Richard cleared his throat. Perhaps we should let you two work out the details privately. There aren't many details to work out, I said. Sandra wants a divorce. She's entitled to half our assets. We'll split everything down the middle and go our separate ways. What about the house? Patricia asked. Sandra can have it if she wants it, I said, or we can sell it and split the proceeds. What about alimony? Derek asked. Sandra has a good job and half our assets. She won't need alimony. I could see the family processing this information, trying to figure out if I was being generous or difficult. The truth was, I was being practical. Fighting about money would only give lawyers a share of our wealth. A clean split was better for everyone. Where will you live? Kelly asked me. I'll figure something out. The remainder of the evening was awkward but civil. Sandra's family tried to make conversation about other topics, but the divorce announcement had changed the dynamic. I was no longer the son-in-law they tolerated. I was the soon-to-be ex-husband who was handling their daughter's liberation with suspicious grace. Sandra and I drove home in silence. Only when we were in our own driveway did she speak. You're really not going to fight this? What would be the point? Most husbands would at least try to save their marriage. I turned off the engine and sat in the dark garage for a moment, thinking about how to respond. Sandra, I said finally, for 15 years your family has treated me like I wasn't good enough for you. They've questioned my intelligence, my ambition, my ability to provide for you appropriately. You've defended me sometimes, but you've also agreed with them more often than not. She didn't deny it. Now you're telling me that you want to leave because I won't live the way they think we should live, because I won't spend our money the way they think we should spend it. Because I won't become the kind of person they think you should be married to. It's not about them, it's entirely about them. You're not unhappy with our life. You're unhappy with what our life looks like to other people. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. Maybe that's true, she said finally, but it doesn't change how I feel. I know, that's why I'm not going to fight this. You never really loved me, did you? The question surprised me. Of course I loved you. I still love you. Then why are you letting me go so easily? I thought about how to explain something she'd never understand. Because love isn't about holding on to someone who wants to leave. It's about wanting what's best for them, even if that's not you. Sandra started crying then, quietly at first, then with the kind of sobs that come from deep regret. I've made a terrible mistake, she said. Maybe, but it's your mistake to make. We sat in the dark garage for another few minutes while Sandra cried, and I wondered what would happen next. Not to our assets or our house, but to the person I'd been for 15 years. The husband, the son-in-law, the truck driver who'd surprised everyone by building wealth while they weren't paying attention. Tomorrow, I'd start becoming someone new. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth. Sandra hired Jennifer's attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Foster, who specialized in high-asset divorces. I hired a local attorney who handled business matters for some of the trucking companies I'd worked with over the years. The first settlement conference revealed just how little Sandra understood about the wealth we'd accumulated together. Mrs. Watson is seeking half of all marital assets, Rebecca Foster announced as we sat around the conference table, including investment accounts, real estate holdings and business interests. That's fine, my attorney replied. Minister Watson has prepared a complete asset disclosure. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was a detailed breakdown of everything we owned. Investment accounts totaling $847,000, 5 rental properties with combined equity of $412,000, and our primary residence worth $298,000. Rebecca Foster reviewed the documents with growing amazement. Mr. Watson, this portfolio is quite impressive for someone in transportation. Thank you. How did you accumulate this level of wealth on a truck driver's salary? It was a fair question, and one that Sandra's family had never bothered to ask during 15 years of marriage. Careful investing and real estate speculation, I said, plus living below our means and reinvesting profits instead of spending them. Rebecca made notes. Mrs. Watson, you were aware of these assets? Sandra nodded. I had access to all the accounts. I just never added it all up. That statement captured everything about our marriage. Sandra had access to the information but no interest in understanding what it meant. She'd been content to let me handle the financial strategy while she focused on other things. The division seemed straightforward. My attorney said, Mrs. Watson can choose which assets she wants to take as her half, or we can liquidate everything and split the cash proceeds. I want to keep the house, Sandra said immediately. That's fine, but the house is only worth $300,000. You'd need to take an additional $478,000 from other assets to reach your full settlement amount. Rebecca Foster did quick calculations on her legal pad. That would require liquidating most of the investment accounts. Is that a problem? Sandra asked. Not legally, I said, but it means you'd be trading income-generating assets for a house that only costs money to maintain. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and showed Sandra the investment app I'd been using to track our portfolio. These accounts generate about $60,000 a year in dividends, interest and rental income, I explained. If you liquidate them to buy the house outright, you lose that income stream. Sandra stared at the numbers. I had no idea the investments were producing income. Where did you think our living expenses came from? We spent about $70,000 a year, but my trucking income is only $55,000. I thought we were just spending your salary and saving the investment money. This revelation shocked even her attorney. Sandra had been living on investment income for years without realizing it. Miss Watson, Rebecca Foster said carefully, you might want to reconsider the asset division. Taking the house would eliminate most of your passive income, but I need somewhere to live. You could take a smaller portion of the house equity and keep more of the income-generating assets, I suggested. Or you could sell the house and buy something smaller, keeping the extra money invested. Sandra looked confused and overwhelmed. She'd wanted the divorce so she could live more freely, but she was discovering that managing wealth required knowledge she didn't possess. Can we take a break? She asked. During the recess, Sandra and her attorney huddled in the hallway while I sat with mine, reviewing the numbers one more time. She's going to have a hard time maintaining her lifestyle on settlement assets alone, my attorney observed. I know, you could offer alimony to help with the transition. She said she didn't want alimony. She wanted independence. When we reconvened, Sandra had made her decision. I want to modify my request, she said. I'll take $200,000 in cash and the rest in investment assets, but I want Bill to continue managing the investment portion for the first year while I learn how to do it myself. Her attorney looked surprised. Mrs. Watson, it's unusual to maintain financial ties with an ex-spouse. I don't know how to manage investments, Sandra said simply. I don't want to lose everything because I'm learning. I was touched by her honesty and her willingness to admit what she didn't know. I'd be willing to continue managing your investment accounts, I said, but only if you promise to learn the basics so you can take over within a year. I promise. The final settlement was structured as Sandra had requested. She would receive $200,000 in cash, $578,500 in investment assets that I would manage temporarily, and the house free and clear. I would keep the remaining investment assets and rental properties, plus my business equipment and retirement accounts. We signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in June. Sandra cried as she signed each document. I felt numb, like I was watching someone else's life end. After the attorneys left, Sandra and I sat in the empty conference room. I made a mistake, she said quietly. We both made mistakes. No, Bill, I made the mistake. You tried to build something good and I threw it away. because I was embarrassed by what other people thought. I didn't know what to say to that. "Is there any chance we could try again?" she asked. "Maybe go back to counseling. Maybe figure out a compromise." I looked at the woman I'd been married to for 15 years. She was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely sorry for the pain she'd caused. 6 months earlier, I would have said yes immediately, but something had changed during the divorce process. I'd realized that Sandra's family would always see me as not good enough. Her friends would always question why she'd settled for a truck driver, and Sandra herself would always feel caught between loyalty to me and pressure from her social circle. "I don't think so," I said gently. "Too much has happened. Because of the money, because of what the money revealed about who we are and what we want out of life." Sandra nodded, accepting what she didn't want to hear. "Will you be okay?" she asked. "I'll be fine. Will you?" "I hope so. I'm scared, honestly. I've never managed money before. You'll learn, and if you make mistakes, they'll be your mistakes to make." We hugged goodbye in the parking garage, and I watched her drive away in the car she'd bought with our settlement money. Then I got in my truck and drove toward a future I couldn't yet imagine. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I made 2 major changes to my life. First, I bought a small ranch in Montana, 40 acres outside Bozeman, with a modest house and room for horses I didn't yet own. The property cost $180,000, which I paid in cash without affecting my investment strategy. Second, I started a consulting business for truck drivers who wanted to learn about investing. I called it Road Wealth Strategies, and I offered seminars at truck stops across the country, teaching drivers how to turn their steady income into long-term wealth. The business grew quickly through word of mouth. Turns out there were a lot of drivers who understood that trucking could be more than just a paycheck if you approached it strategically. Sandra, meanwhile, was learning to manage her settlement money with mixed results. She'd hired Derek as her financial advisor, which probably wasn't the best choice given his tendency toward leverage and lifestyle inflation. She bought a condo in Carmel for $320,000, using most of her cash settlement as a down payment. The monthly mortgage and HOA fees ate up most of the income from her investment accounts, leaving her dependent on her nursing salary for living expenses. 6 months after moving into the condo, she called me. "I made another mistake," she said without preamble. "What kind of mistake?" "A financial one. Derek convinced me to invest in some kind of limited partnership that was supposed to generate high returns. I put $100,000 into it." My stomach dropped. "What kind of limited partnership? Some real estate development project, shopping centers or something?" Derek said it was a sure thing. I'd seen this movie before. Limited partnerships were often vehicles for sophisticated investors to take money from unsophisticated ones. "How much have you lost?" "Probably all of it. The developer filed for bankruptcy last month. $100,000. Gone." Sandra had lost more money in 6 months than I'd spent in the previous 3 years. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Derek says these things happen, that it's part of learning to invest." Derek was an idiot who'd just cost his sister-in-law 20% of her divorce settlement while collecting fees for the privilege. "Can I give you some advice?" I asked. "Please, fire Derek. Find a fee-only financial advisor who charges by the hour instead of taking percentages, and stick to index funds and blue-chip stocks until you understand what you're doing. Will you help me find someone?" I paused, knowing that getting involved in Sandra's financial life again was probably a mistake. "I'll send you some names," I said finally. A year after our divorce, Sandra sold the condo and moved back to a rental apartment. She'd burned through most of her settlement money on bad investments and lifestyle expenses she couldn't afford. Her income from the remaining investment accounts wasn't enough to support the life she'd wanted to live. She called me one evening in tears. "I've lost everything," she said. "Everything we built together. Not everything. You still have your job, your health, your family. I don't have security. I don't have a future. I gave up the best thing in my life because I was embarrassed by how good I had it." I wanted to comfort her, but there wasn't much I could say. Sandra had made her choices based on what mattered to her at the time. The consequences were hers to bear. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Start over, I guess. Be more careful. Maybe find someone who understands money better than I do. Or learn to understand it yourself. I'm trying. It's harder than I thought." 2 years after our divorce, I sold Road Wealth Strategies to a larger financial education company for $400,000. The business had grown beyond what I could manage while still driving truck, and I was ready for the next chapter. I bought more land in Montana, started raising horses, and began writing a book about building wealth in blue-collar professions. The book became a bestseller in its niche, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities I'd never imagined. Sandra remarried in 2025. Her new husband was a cardiologist, who lived in exactly the kind of house she'd always wanted, in exactly the kind of neighborhood that impressed her family. She seemed happy in the photos she posted on social media. I was happy for her. She'd found someone who shared her values about lifestyle and status, someone who could provide the life she'd wanted without requiring her to understand how it was financed. As for me, I was content with my ranch, my horses, and the quiet satisfaction of having built something lasting. I never remarried, though I dated occasionally. Most women in my social circle found it hard to believe that a former truck driver could afford the lifestyle I'd created in Montana. I didn't bother to correct their assumptions. The final chapter of this story came 3 years after our divorce, when Sandra's family invited me to Derek's wedding. Kelly had left him after discovering his gambling problem and the debt he'd hidden from her. Derek was now marrying his former secretary, a woman who didn't know about his financial problems. I almost didn't go, but curiosity got the better of me. The wedding was smaller than Derek's first, held at a more modest venue. The Montgomery family was polite but distant when they greeted me. I was no longer part of their world, no longer someone they needed to judge or accommodate. During the reception, Richard Montgomery approached me at the bar. "Bill," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Congratulations on Derek's wedding." Richard nodded. "He's had a rough few years. The divorce, some business problems. Hopefully this fresh start will help." I didn't mention that I knew about Derek's business problems because he'd lost Sandra's money along with his own. "How have you been?" Richard asked. "Sandra mentioned you'd moved to Montana." "I'm doing well, enjoying the change of pace. Still driving truck." I smiled. "No, I retired from trucking. I'm in financial education now." Richard looked puzzled. "Financial education? I teach people how to build wealth, mostly blue-collar workers who want to secure their financial futures. That's interesting. How did you get into that field?" It was the first time in 20 years that Richard had asked me a genuine question about my capabilities rather than making assumptions about my limitations. "Same way I got into successful investing," I replied, "by paying attention to opportunities that other people overlooked." We talked for a few more minutes about markets and economic trends. Richard was actually knowledgeable about finance, and for the first time we had a conversation as equals rather than as a lawyer talking down to a truck driver. As the evening wound down, Patricia Montgomery joined us. "Bill, you look well," she said warmly. "Country life must agree with you." "It does. Sandra mentioned that you've written a book about investing strategies for working-class professionals." Patricia smiled. "I always suspected you were more complicated than you appeared." "More complicated. Not smarter, not more capable, just more complicated. Even now, after everything that had happened, Sandra's family couldn't quite admit that they'd fundamentally misjudged me. But it didn't matter anymore. Their opinions had cost Sandra a secure future and me a marriage, but they couldn't touch what I'd built since then. I drove back to Montana the next morning, through landscapes that reminded me why I'd chosen this life over the one Sandra's family had mapped out for successful people. My ranch sat in a valley between mountain ranges, 40 acres of peace and possibility. The horses grazed in pastures I'd paid for with money earned by understanding that wealth wasn't about appearing successful. It was about being free. Free from other people's expectations, free from the need to justify my choices to anyone who thought they knew better, free from the pressure to live according to someone else's definition of success. I thought about Sandra sometimes, wondering if she'd learned to be happy with her cardiologist husband's version of the good life. I hoped she had. She deserved happiness, even if we'd never been able to find it together. But mostly, I thought about the drivers I'd met through Road Wealth Strategies. Men and women who were building their own financial independence 1 mile at a time. They understood what Sandra's family never had, that real wealth isn't about what you buy, it's about what you build. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sandra had left me because she thought I'd never amount to anything more than a truck driver who was too cheap to live well. By the time she realized her mistake, I'd become something her family would have respected. A successful businessman, author, and entrepreneur. But I'd become those things by staying true to the principles they'd mocked, by understanding that image and substance are different things, by knowing that the opinions of people who judge others by their job titles or their zip codes aren't worth the cost of impressing them. 5 years after our divorce, I received an unexpected phone call. Sandra's voice was older, more mature, but still familiar. "Bill," she said, "I hope it's okay that I'm calling." "Of course. How are you?" "I'm well. Married, as you probably heard. Michael is a good man. I'm glad you're happy." There was a pause. I wanted to apologize. For what? For not understanding what we had when we had it. for letting my family's opinions matter more than your efforts, for throwing away 15 years of partnership because I was embarrassed by their judgment. I sat on my porch looking out at the mountains, thinking about how to respond. We both made mistakes, Sandra. No, she said firmly. You made sacrifices. I made mistakes. There's a difference. Another pause. I read your book, she continued. It made me realize how much I never understood about what you were building, about what we could have had if I'd been willing to learn instead of demanding that you change. The book wasn't about us, wasn't it? The whole thing is about people who build wealth by ignoring what other people think, about staying focused on long-term goals instead of short-term appearances, about understanding that real security comes from making smart decisions, not impressive ones. She wasn't wrong. The book had been about truck drivers and construction workers and waitresses who'd built million-dollar portfolios while their college-educated friends accumulated debt to finance lifestyles they couldn't afford. But it was also about the choice between substance and image, between building something real and buying something temporary. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, Sandra said, and I'm sorry I wasn't smart enough to be part of it. You were part of it. For 15 years you were part of it. I was a passenger. I never understood what you were doing or why it mattered. I just enjoyed the security without appreciating how you'd created it. We talked for another few minutes about safe topics, her new life, my ranch, mutual friends from the old days. But the real conversation had already happened in those first few minutes. Sandra had finally understood what she'd given up, but understanding it now didn't change the fact that she'd given it up when it mattered. After we hung up, I walked out to the pasture where my horses were grazing. They looked up as I approached, curious but not concerned. Animals understand something that people often don't, that contentment comes from having what you need, not from getting what you want. I'd spent 22 years driving trucks across America, watching landscapes change with the seasons, learning about markets and opportunities from the ground level up. I'd spent 15 years building a marriage that ended when image became more important than substance. I'd spent the last 5 years learning to be happy with my own company and my own choices. Looking back, I wouldn't change much. The mistakes had been educational. The setbacks had been temporary. The choices that seemed difficult at the time had led to a life I genuinely enjoyed. Sandra's family had been wrong about me from the beginning. They'd seen a truck driver and assumed limitations that didn't exist. They'd confused education with intelligence, status with substance, appearance with reality. But their mistake had been my opportunity. By underestimating me, they'd given me the freedom to build wealth without interference. By dismissing my strategies, they'd protected me from pressure to make decisions based on their approval rather than financial logic. In the end, Sandra had gotten what she'd wanted. A husband who lived up to her family's expectations, a house that impressed her friends, a lifestyle that looked successful from the outside. And I'd gotten what I'd wanted: financial independence, peace of mind, and the satisfaction of knowing that I'd built something lasting through my own efforts and judgment. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My horses wandered closer, hoping for treats I didn't have. In the distance, I could hear the hum of traffic on the interstate, trucks carrying freight to destinations across the country, drivers building their own versions of the American dream 1 mile at a time. Some of those drivers would spend their money as fast as they made it, retiring broke despite decades of steady income. Others would invest carefully, building portfolios that would provide security long after they stopped driving. The difference wouldn't be in their education, their family background, or the opinions of people who thought they knew better. The difference would be in their willingness to ignore what others expected and focus on what actually worked. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, through a marriage that ended when expectations became more important than partnership, through in-laws who never saw past their own assumptions, through social pressure that valued appearance over substance. But I'd learned it thoroughly, and now, standing in a pasture I owned free and clear, surrounded by animals I'd bought with money I'd earned through strategies that had seemed foolish to people who thought they were smarter than me, I could honestly say it had been worth every mile. The truck driver they'd underestimated had built exactly the life he'd wanted, not the life they'd thought he should want, but the life that actually made him happy. And in the end, that was the only opinion that mattered. So I ask you, have you ever been underestimated because of what others assumed about your profession, your background, or your potential? Have you ever watched people dismiss your capabilities while secretly building something they never saw coming? Share your story in the comments below, because at Human Stories, we believe that the most powerful victories are often the quietest ones. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to hear that real success isn't about impressing other people, it's about building something that lasts. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply proving that you never needed their approval in the first place.